This is going to be a weird video. I'm going to cover the 3 Fire Emblem remakes next. Shadow Dragon and New Mystery of the Emblem on the DS, and Shadows of Valentia on the 3DS. The thing with the remakes in this series is that my complaints about one of them more or less apply to all of them, even though there were 2 other games on the 3DS in between New Mystery and Shadows of Valentia, so try to bear with the odd approach I'm taking here. So, let's begin with Shadow Dragon. Shadow Dragon came out in 2009 on the Nintendo DS. It is a remake of the very first Fire Emblem game ever, which was very appealing to players outside of Japan. Finally, they could experience the original game and without the clunkiness of the Famicom interface. Unfortunately, when Shadow Dragon did in fact get released over here, most players found themselves disappointed. Shadow Dragon wasn't a bad game, but it certainly didn't do a good job making itself stand out. In fact, it performed so poorly that the follow-up, New Mystery, wasn't even released outside of Japan. That and it was nearly at the end of the DS lifecycle, I suppose. So what was disappointing about Shadow Dragon? Well, it should first be pointed out that the original game came out in 1990, where the standards for Fire Emblem weren't established yet. The plot was minimal. The characters spoke very few lines, sometimes none at all. Some maps were big, open plains with nothing in them. The final chapter had the potential to be rendered unwinnable. So what should a remake of such a game do? Remakes in the video game industry serve 2 purposes. 1, they make older titles available to a wider audience, and 2, they fix problems with the original game while keeping the spirit of the original, leading to a better experience overall for everybody. One example of a really great remake in my opinion is Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as they updated the mechanics, added new content, and the spirit of the original versions is very much still there, but it applies what the developers had learned about game design since then. But in Shadow Dragon, while there is new content and updated mechanics, Shadow Dragon actually changed very little of the original's level design and narrative. The story of the original version is kept intact to the point that most characters don't get that many new lines. A lot of characters say something when they join you, then nothing at all until they die. While there's more dialogue than the original, especially for Marth himself and his advisors, Shadow Dragon's plot is still woefully generic, and what's also stunning is that there are no support conversations at all in this game. Radiant Dawn didn't have conversations, but I attributed that to the massive cast the game sported. Maybe the cast was too big in Shadow Dragon 2, but they could have just cut some of the filler characters. I really don't understand this need to keep every character from the original game. Really, guys like Riss and those armors Medea hangs around with serve next to no purpose, so if a bloated cast is hindering the amount of dialogue they can write, it honestly ought to be clear what to do about it. Now, it should be noted that this isn't a one-to-one remake of the original. The weapon triangle is used, letter grade weapon ranks are used, there's only one universal promotion item, the preparation screen is the usual for the series, and you can even forge like in Radiant Dawn, as much as you want, only this time you're allowed to forge special weapons like the rapier, which can be extremely game-breaking. There is also a brand new system in place. Reclassing is a tool that allows characters to outright switch to a different class whenever they want. Mages can be priests or myrmidons whenever they want, although there are limits to it. Character growths also change depending on what class they are, and you can have some actual fun with this since it lets you do dumb stuff like making your knights into defensive swordsmen or turning clerics into superpowered mages. An issue arises with all this, however. The mechanics that I've just mentioned, like forges and reclassing, and even the weapon triangle, are all mechanics the original game wasn't designed around, because they didn't exist yet. Level design adheres closely to the original game, to the point of including maps that were cut in Mystery of the Emblem because of how boring they were. One result of this is that eventually axes stop being used by the enemy, even though wyverns and heroes are able to use them like in the GBA games. You could use nothing but spears in later chapters and rarely run into a triangle disadvantage. Forging is just insane. You could save all your money for forging one-hit kill weapons, like the Wing Spear, a personal weapon for Sheeta that was introduced because they wanted to give her something in exchange for not being able to use the Silver Lance in the first chapter like she could originally. I have no idea why they did that, but nearly all the bosses take triple damage from the Wing Spear. Doesn't this seem like it would constitute a glaring balance issue? In addition to not changing the level design to account for new mechanics, they actually took the gameplay depth a step backwards by adhering to the original design. This game doesn't use a skill system, which combined with reclassing makes characters feel even less unique. Not to mention that for some reason, Merrick and Linda's exclusive spells are now usable by anyone if their magic rank is high enough. Rescuing isn't implemented, ranged staves are back to being infinite range, so warp skip to your heart's delight, I guess. Manakeths are back to their GBA forms even after the Lagoo's perfected shapeshifting based fighters. Dismounting is not implemented, assuming reclassing doesn't count as dismounting, and there's also only one type of magic, despite there being 3 distinct promoted mage classes. I guess they didn't see the purpose of multiple magic types with their own triangle, but isn't it odd to have bishops, sages, and sorcerers with no real differentiating qualities? Speaking of triangles, the weapon triangle gets introduced to a game that didn't originally have it, but here they put forward an interesting concept. The bonus you get from the triangle now depends on the weapon rank of the guy with the advantage. It's an interesting idea, although with such a low boost you're not going to be able to dodge many of the pirates in the early game on the higher difficulties. Their hit rates are going to be too high. Normally the triangle allows you to reduce this somewhat to where you can consistently dodge, but now you can't do that on the harder difficulties. There are 6 levels of difficulty this time around, all of which seem to affect only the enemy stats. Normal mode is just pathetic, you can steamroll it quickly. It has new tutorial maps that provide a little more context to the start of Marth's journey, but it also has new characters you can't get on the hard modes because obtaining them requires you to kill off people during the tutorial. Meanwhile, the highest difficulty levels are as brutal as they should be, but if you know what you're doing, eventually you can get through it. Shadow Dragon's cast is certainly big enough that you can afford to use some as cannon fodder. Speaking of which, they also included Gaiden chapters, which were absent in the previous 2 console games, but this has to be the most ridiculous joke I've ever seen. Unlocking Gaiden chapters in this game requires killing off your entire army. I'm not kidding. Fire Emblem veterans like me will never ever play the Gaiden chapters or see the new characters in them because we've been conditioned to avoid death up until now because it's still permanent. This game even gives you generic replacement characters if you die too much, the names of which chastise you for letting it happen, yet the requirement for seeing the new content is to continue letting them die. What exactly were they going for here? Now, I don't want this to sound completely negative, so I should point out a few positives. Touch controls were added, same as Advance Wars Days of Ruin, and they work nicely if you choose to use them. You can now fast forward the game significantly, to the point that you can skip the enemy phase entirely, which is excellent. Those enemy phases can get very long. Save points were added to maps, which saves players from having to reset entire chapters due to bad luck, and saving anywhere would have been overpowered, so this is a nice middle ground. A multiplayer mode was added, and it's the best one so far, because you actually fight on a grid instead of that boring Link Arena. The maps for this mode are played in Fog of War, which also operates on the same rules as Days of Ruin, and there's an objective on the map to discourage camping. Your army can only have 5 characters, however, and there's also an online shop that sells brave weapons. Or at least there was. It's not there anymore due to the online shutdown, which means the brave weapons and a special promotion item that lets you access the Falcon Knight class are no longer available without a hack. Oh, and did I mention the Pegasus Knights still become Wyvern Knights without this special promotion item? It feels so weird. There are so many weird decisions here. What's also strange is making Shadow Dragon a standalone title in the first place. When Mystery of the Emblem came out, it was a package that included both a remake and a sequel. You could argue that the remake of the original was included as an afterthought. It's not nearly as detailed, and the original game alone isn't worth a purchase by itself unless you seriously improve upon it. So New Mystery of the Emblem being a separate game entirely felt just a little strange. Nothing I'm upset about, aside from the fact that it never released outside Japan, and unless it does, we'll be missing one of the 6 pre-Blazing Sword games for a very long time. Shadow Dragon is not the worst thing ever, but if you've played the Super Nintendo version, there isn't much more to it that'll appeal to you. The Super Nintendo version just felt as good as Akanea could possibly get. Same goes for Book 2 and its remake. Much of what I talked about applies to New Mystery of the Emblem, the remake of the second half of the remake/sequel. This is getting confusing. Again, it adheres to the original chapters and level design, but not 100%. Chapter 1 improved, but Mathis is still the usual pain in the ass to recruit. The big new feature of this game is the introduction of My Unit. His official name is Chris, but you can name him or her and change their appearance. In other words, a player avatar. His stats are customizable as well. Chris has actually earned the ire of the Fire Emblem community because he's a self-insert player character being introduced into an already established canon. Kinda feels like a theme with these remakes, actually. New feature messing with old level design, but I digress. Chris actually takes the spotlight off of other characters quite a lot, and the characters praise him quite often for it. Several prologue chapters and the new Gaiden chapters, which thank goodness don't have the horrible requirements they did before, deal with a subplot involving Chris and his would-be girlfriend Katarina, which distracts from the unchanged main plot. This isn't like Mark from Blazing Sword, who was such an afterthought that his existence was entirely optional. Also, did I just call Katarina Chris's girlfriend? What does that mean if Chris was made female by the player? Moving on. They also introduced something called Casual Mode. I really hate calling it that, but Casual Mode is basically an option that makes characters come back to life in the next chapter if they die. Now honestly, I think something like that was bound to happen sooner or later because it's too frustrating to lose a character you worked hard to build up because of some unlucky dice roll, and far more annoying to reset the entire chapter just to reverse it. Or they might have included it because New Mystery also brought back ambush spawns. Isn't that just fantastic? Bringing back a bad gameplay idea, and for what, nostalgia? But a death accrues no penalty in casual mode, save not being able to use them for the remainder of the chapter. Bad news if it was the thief, I guess. I'm actually going to recommend playing classic mode on your first run and see if you prefer casual, because I ended up preferring having to be more careful to avoid deaths. Casual mode sticks around in future titles, and I was hoping they would implement some kind of penalty for dying in it, though I don't really know what would work for it. Everything I could come up with was either ignorable or severe enough to force a reset anyways. It is thankfully an option, and New Mystery's rather tacked-on ranking system at least takes note of the number of deaths, even in casual mode. New Mystery of the Emblem was also the start of some elements that were amplified in the 3DS games. If you stop playing the game for a little while, when you start up again you might notice you've gotten a few random items or bonuses, and there's also downloadable content, most of which you won't access without a cheat device nowadays, but hey. You can also spend gold on EXP in the preparations menu. It's like a mini arena, but you don't win gold for it. It's strictly for gaining experience points. And they also included conversations that unlock when two units are used in the same battle. Sort of like supports, but you don't gain any statistical bonuses for it. So it's not quite the same. Chris can get these conversations with anybody, so at least the boring one-note units that you're bound to get a chance to talk a little. This game also pulls a Radiant Dawn by including every character from Shadow Dragon, leading to a bloated cast. Everybody from Shadow Dragon is present and accounted for. Riss, Roger, those three axe fighters, the new people from the Gaiden chapters like Etzel and Athena. Hell, they even made it so you could recruit Wolf, Violent, and Sedgar, even though in the original version of this game, you had no choice but to kill them. It was supposed to be a tragedy that you have no choice but to kill your former comrades. That's the entire idea behind the type of character they represent. But now you're able to get them on your side and have them fight against their own countrymen. You can make Wolf kill his own Master Hardin, who is the only character you cannot recruit ever. Oh, and Shadow Dragon's prologue actually makes you sacrifice one of your characters. But this game undoes all of that by revealing that the sacrifice didn't actually die. I feel like we're cheapening a bunch of deaths here. It's so weird. This game also retired the mechanic where weapons weigh you down and lower your speed if they're too heavy for you. Weapons no longer cause any sort of speed loss, which means the enemy thieves can use whatever weapons they want when they double you constantly. So yeah, they noticed weight did nothing but punish mages ever since Path of Radiance made it so the strength stat governed the severity of the speed loss instead of the constitution stat like in the GBA games. So instead of reversing a bad change, the mechanic was removed entirely. Hooray, there's no downside to the heaviest of axes being in the hands of the smallest unit. Why are we reducing the gameplay depth? I'm starting to think that any change the 3DS games brought was actually introduced in new mystery and I should be blaming that instead. Regardless, I just got done ranting about the two DS games, but these are not by any stretch actually awful games. They're solid enough. But after Radiant Dawn and especially Path of Radiance, I guess I expected more. Between new mechanics breaking games they weren't made for, canon being rewritten for Chris, and side quests that require you to kill off your party to access them, there's just so much wrong here. Which brings us to Shadows of Valentia. It's a remake of Gaiden, completing the trio of remakes in the Akanea universe, and to be honest, we should have been shouting "Valentia confirmed!" for quite a while, considering how the 3DS games have this weird obsession with Gaiden. That's because Gaiden's design and mechanics fit perfectly with the paradigm shift that the 3DS games brought in. More on that when I get to complaining about how they ruined Fire Emblem forever. I expected the worst coming off of Awakening and Fates, but Shadows of Valentia actually did more right than I expected. The interface is the same as the other 3DS games, controlling very well and letting you view enemy ranges. This game actually has some serious production values. Cutscenes are animated extremely well, and there's voice acting for every line of dialogue, and they sound like actual humans this time. Towns now have a visual novel-like interface, dungeons control like a Zelda game, right down to smashing pots for items. A fatigue-like system was introduced. If a unit fights too much in a dungeon without using a healing item, you'll notice their max HP starts decreasing. There are various food items in place of vulneraries that can restore more or less HP and fatigue, based on the unit's preference. These are some neat details. The only true issue is that I barely ever run into the fatigue problem at all anyways, but the game benefits from actually having vulnerary items in the first place, so it's cool. Forging got an overhaul in Shadows of Valentia. You're basically buying non-customizable upgrades, but I suppose if you can get the same result as something from Shadow Dragon, it's not any worse than before. Traditional gold isn't present, you instead collect silver and gold marks. They also actually added side quests in towns. Though it's mostly fetch quests, at least they're not glorified or anything crazy. Though I do think it's funny you can help a woodcutter by gifting him with the Devil Axe. I sure hope that thing only backfires when it strikes flesh, not wood. There's also a mechanic that lets you reverse time in order to undo mistakes, though there's limits on it. I don't really have an opinion on that one. I'm just happy I can still choose not to use it. I'm amazed they included it though, because casual mode is still present, and Gaiden battles aren't that long individually anyways. The biggest new addition is the overhaul of skills, some of which are known as combat arts. These are obtained by equipping a weapon and keeping it for long enough. It's a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics' weapon ability system, which was later used in Final Fantasy IX and the rest of the Tactics games. There are quite a few combat arts out there, and it's a new idea for Fire Emblem that I actually kind of like. It fits much better in a game where weapons have no durability, such as Gaiden. Even pieces of armor can have a skill on them, though what annoys me to no end is the price to using them. Just like the magic system, you pay HP to use combat arts. What exactly is wrong with adding an MP meter so I don't have to put myself in danger to actually use any of my new abilities? And if HP is the cost, doesn't that mean I can use all my skills and then cast Fortify to get all my HP back anyways? Which brings me to a huge problem I have with Shadows of Valentia. None of the core elements of Gaiden have been changed whatsoever. Magic costs HP, you level up slow, character growth suck, thereby encouraging a lot of grinding. Yet again, you never know what spells a potential mage is going to learn. Promotions now just bring the unit stats up to the base of the new class, which is a massive downgrade. Seriously, we ditched that back in the Super Nintendo days, and in spite of introducing a reclass mechanic in the DS games, they've preserved that strange mercenary promotion look the original game has. The map design is boring like usual. Nothing was done to fix the slowest chapters. Boat battles, deserts, zombies. It's not that the game is a massive time sink because you can still skip enemy phases and such, but the fights aren't that exciting or interesting either. Oh, but at least you can still kill the final boss with Nosferatu. Now that's important, we've gotta keep that. The weapon triangle isn't here either, but with no playable axe users it's perfectly understandable here. Gaiden would need a pretty big overhaul to implement it, so I don't mind it as much. However, I'm going to end this on some positives. Supports are back, and this helps flesh out the Gaiden cast tremendously. New characters include a female villager that can become a cleric or Pegasus Knight, and if she picks cleric, you can learn a spell that gives another unit an extra turn, like a dancer. And the more Falcon Knights you have, the better. They do extra damage to monsters. Did I mention that? The writing in Shadows of Valentia is done very well. I guess you could say they had a head start considering it's a remake, but the original game still had very minimalist writing, so they've expanded upon the original story and even added new characters that actually complement the story quite well. If you have never played Gaiden before, Shadows of Valentia is a much better option for it than the original game, which I did actually finish a couple nights ago. It wasn't worth it. No way was it worth it. But I do think the remake at least made the story part of the game function well enough, unlike Shadow Dragon. So yeah, when it comes to remakes, I don't think Fire Emblem has the best track record in the world. For the DS games, you're likely better off playing Mystery of the Emblem on the Super Nintendo. For Shadows of Valentia, the story and interface improvements put it far above the NES original, but the level design and game mechanics remain mostly unchanged, so the battles still feel extremely old. We've still got 2 games on the 3DS left to cover, and, well, we're going to see Gaiden start to influence the series big time, so look forward to that, I guess. I need to find a way to get some 3DS footage.